Hello, I'm Elizabeth Guest from Aspie Dent. Today we're going to talk about meltdowns, shutdowns and temper tantrums. So the key things to get out of this presentation are: what are meltdowns and shutdowns? What are the differences? What causes them? What do you do? How do you deal with them? How do you prevent them? And how can you tell the difference between meltdowns and temper tantrums? A question we often get asked. So we're going to cover what they are, what causes them, what you should do when one happens, how can you prevent them or even head them off, and telling the difference between meltdowns and temper tantrums. So meltdowns, it's basically an explosion of emotion. Things get too much, you get an explosion of emotion. In contrast, a shutdown is an implosion of emotion. So with a meltdown, it looks very much like a temper tantrum, people all over the place, screaming, shouting, banging, flapping hands. But with a shutdown, you're talking about withdrawal from the world. So it might be very minor. They might just refuse to interact with you for a while. They might want to go somewhere and just be by themselves. And it can progress increasingly more from minor to severe until you basically get a collapse because everything's just got too much. And their system has just shut down and they're withdrawn from the world. Those are rare though. You're more likely to get no interaction or wandering away and just being by themselves, crawling under a bed or something. So what causes these things? So sensory overload is one of the key ones. It's actually the easiest one to deal with because once you've identified the sensory issues, you can actually predict under which circumstances you are likely to get a meltdown or a shutdown. So if somebody's hypersensitive to noise or can't cope with crowds, avoid them as much as possible. Now notice that sensory overload can build up with time. So somebody might be able to cope with a crowded, busy, noisy place for half an hour, but no longer. So it's useful to know how much somebody can cope with. It is not a good idea though to try and say, right, you can cope with half an hour, so we'll gradually build it up so you can cope. That's not going to work. That's not the right approach. You just have to go with their limitations. Other causes are frustration, lack of understanding what's going on, bewilderment, not understanding, and just being overwhelmed because there's too much going on, too much to understand, too much to process. A very common one, especially with school children, is the effort of pretending to be normal. So they go to school, they sit through their classes, they do their work, they sort of interact with people to a greater or lesser extent, depending on how their autism affects them. And then they get home and you have an explosion. And you cannot convince the school that there's a problem because the school sees a very well-behaved child. And under these circumstances, it's incredibly difficult to get a diagnosis because you're the only one that sees the problem. And what's going on is the general build-up of stress over the day, child being good, child basically not being autistic, trying to fit in, trying to be normal, but then once they get home, it's all too much. However, I suppose letting it out when you get home is better than bottling it in and coming up with severe mental health problems. It can also be a case of general build-up of a stress over time that builds up incrementally over months without anyone realising, and then suddenly the tiniest of triggers will trigger a meltdown. And you'll wonder where it came from. And these can be the hardest ones to try and figure out what to do with because it's built up over such a long period that you don't actually know, or it's very difficult to figure out what the actual issues are. And then finally, there's things that can cause meltdown is the actual effort of interacting with people. Interacting with people is quite complex, very brain processing intensive because you've got to process themselves and you've got to monitor yourself, you've got to monitor how they're reacting. And some autistic people can cope with that for a short period of time and then it all gets too much. Or sometimes a longer period of time. And the key here, especially when dealing with children, is to be aware of the specific signs for that child as to when they're having enough. It's when they've had enough. So they might push you away, they might turn away, they might stop responding. And instead of trying to encourage them to keep interacting with you, it's better to give them some space to avoid a meltdown. So what should you do? Well, the key thing is if they're in a situation, a busy, noisy place, and it's possible to do so, get them out. If they're in their own room and there's something, or if you're in the home and there's something happening, it's just got too much, and it's possible to do so, you could just leave them where they are and let them calm down. It may help to stay with them. It may be better not to. That very much depends on the child and what their actual triggers are. Staying with them might just increase the overload. But of course, you need to make sure, especially with younger children, that they're going to stay safe. Be careful with touch. It might well increase the overload. Don't try talking to them. That's almost certainly going to increase the overload. But one thing that might help is deep pressure. So pressing them on their hands, on their shoulders, on their arms, quite firmly, or even getting them to lie down and putting some kind of mat on top of them and leaning on top of it to give them some deep pressure, might help, and it might help them calm down quicker. But again, it depends very much on the individual. As they're recovering, or even as they are heading towards meltdown but not there yet, it's a good idea to provide calming activities. So activities that are both enjoyable but calm them down. And again, that will vary from person to person. Some people might just like getting some art materials out and starting to draw and colour in. Other people might just prefer to read a book, to build with blocks. It could be a whole host of things. You need to figure out what your child finds calming, but also enjoyable. And of course that will change as they get older, just to make it a bit more complicated. The key thing with a meltdown or a shutdown is to only talk about what has happened once the person has recovered. So if you try and do it while they're in the recovery process, you're just going to make things worse. So what's the difference between a temper tantrum and a meltdown? Lots of people want to know this. Question we get asked loads of times. Well, it's quite key really. A temper tantrum is caused by somebody who's not getting their own way. So they want something, they don't get it, you get temper tantrum. It can also be caused by frustration that they can't do something. So you've got a new computer game, they can't figure out how to do it. They get very frustrated and they throw the Game Boy or whatever it is across the room, which isn't good for it. And one of the key things here is that temper tantrums tend to be helped by giving in and giving them what they want, giving them attention, giving them reassurance, helping them with this computer game, whereas that doesn't work with meltdowns. So meltdowns are caused by being overwhelmed, not wanting to get your own way, but being overwhelmed in some way. It's too much information, there's sensory overload, or too much effort pretending to be normal. And the key thing is that if you give attention or reassurance, you make it worse. So if it's made better by giving in or giving them some attention and reassurance, then it's most likely been a temper tantrum. So how do you prevent shutdowns and meltdowns? Well, obviously the first thing to do is try and identify the trigger. What are the sensory triggers? Can you minimise exposure to them? For instance, take advantage of quiet hours at supermarkets to avoid the sensory overload, or generally go shopping when it's quiet rather than in the middle of the day or Saturday morning, Saturday afternoon when it's busy. For sensory issues, and especially for younger children, you could try sensory integration therapy, which aims to get the senses working better together, but also to decrease the hypersensitivities and increase any hyposensitivities. And generally get the system working better and more in equilibrium. Works better for younger children, but you can try it with older children as well. A key thing to do is for you to learn the signs, but also to teach the person to learn the signs that things are getting too much and to take evasive action. So get out of there basically. Go and find somewhere calmer. Have something calming with you that you can do to help you calm down. It's key that autistic children and adults get plenty of fun physical activity, because physical activity is known to generally calm systems down, good for stress, and being autistic is very stressful because the world really is an unfriendly place for autism. Have a range of calming activities. Always be on the lookout for new ones. Plenty of sensory toys, they might work, but just watch the person, introduce them to new activities, what actually calms them. And most importantly is to give people time and space to wind down. So don't overschedule your child. Make sure there's plenty of time and space for them to be calmed, calm down, to wind down and to do calming activities. So thank you for listening and watching. We do appreciate feedback, and you can ask questions in the comment section.